Kamara, who is a political scientist by training. I have done a lot of work in terms of the struggle for change in Trinidad and the Caribbean. I'm the author of the IMF to Trinidad and the Caribbean, as well as I did a study on foreign direct investment in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm also the principal of my own school, the Sandu Educational. And I have a special interest in the whole question of structural adjustment, the whole question of the kind of policy environment that we are exposed to in this part of the world, the Caribbean and parts of the third world, especially as it relates to the neoliberal policies which have been introduced over the years and which have contributed to reducing the kind of, or I'd more correctly say, affecting the standard of living of our people generally.
Jerry Kangalee, former Education and Research Officer with the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, former editor of the Vanguard newspaper, which is the newspaper of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, former editor of the newspaper Hold the Fort, which was the organ of the now defunct Committee for Labour Solidarity, involved with the steel band movement, Southern Marines Steel Orchestra, and at this point, Education and Research Officer for the National Workers Union.
The devastating destruction, collapse, I don't know what to call it, of Petrotrin is definitely the issue of the day. And I would like to have your views on not only the impact, but also the events leading up to that situation.
I think what we have to do is place Petrotrin in the context of how state enterprises operate in this country. The company came into being as a result of the struggles of particularly the Oilfield Workers Union and the working people in the Southland against the multinational corporations that were dominating the oil industry in the 60s. Well,
such as
Texaco, BP, Shell, they were all here up to the 60s. Texaco actually left in the 80s. That struggle against the domination of the big transnational energy companies resulted in eventually the formation of Petrotrin. There were a couple of companies that were there before, Trintok and so on, that were also state enterprises, but Petrotrin, as we know, it came into being in the late 1890s, I think. But the problem there is not so much the fact that it is a state enterprise, but it's the fact of how state enterprises operate. State enterprises are seen as a gravy train for particular sections, particularly party hacks, financiers of the political parties and so on. I mean, there's a lot of wastage and a lot of padding that was going on in the company, but that wasn't the problem that led to what we have today. What happened is that in the era when Malcolm Jones was the CEO, the president of Petrotrin, he was very close to the then Prime Minister Patrick Manning, and a lot of transformation was needed in Petrotrin. A lot of investment was needed in order to modernize the refinery so that it could meet the demands of this era. Like, for instance, Petrotrin used to produce a lot of heavy sulfurous, what do you call it? Heavy oil type stuff with a lot of sulfur in it, right? Which became unacceptable on the international market over time. So that they knew as early as 2004, 2003, as far back as then, that they had to modernize the refinery to desulfurize a lot of the stuff that they were making. And they went into certain kinds of arrangements to build certain new plants and so on. And a lot of the arrangements seem to me, in terms of loans that it took from international financial corporations and so on, like Credit Suisse and so on, a lot of these loans were at exorbitant rates, like
What interest rate are they average?
at the time, the government could have got the interest rates at 3 and 4%, and Petrotrin was borrowing only at 10%. And they did not have to, but then you see, you have to look at who was making what kinds of arrangements. I don't want to accuse.
And so who's...
That's right. I don't want to accuse particular individuals of utilizing these things to enrich themselves and so on. But, like for instance, Wendell Motley, who was once the finance minister of the country under Patrick Manning regime, he was the representative of Credit Suisse here. And he was one of the guys who negotiated.
You have what is called the gas optimization program, in which you have the establishment of 5 new plants.
That was when? When?
That was
the
the period 2004.
Yeah.
Okay? And what happened there is that one of the most important plants, which is the ultra low sulfur plant, that is the plant which was considered to be the plant which would have generated significant foreign exchange in the whole new dispensation. But it resulted in what happened, we had an arbitration at the with Samsung. And right now, legally speaking, there's a problem with that plan. But I want to state that the establishment of the gas optimization program, it was not really geared for our benefit. The intention of the transnational corporations, the World Bank, the IMF, all of them, their main objective was to establish a situation in which the state enterprises in the energy sector would return into the hands of the private sector, putting the country in the pre-1970 situation. And that is what has taken place. And what they did is they recognized that the labor movement and the progressive movement had reached a stage of weakness. And they timed the move that we just experienced at a time when the labor movement and the progressive movement were at their weakest point. So that when we look at what is taking place now, we are now importing fuel. And who is the beneficiary? BP Latin America. So we are moving from a situation we were producing fuel and now we are and exporting, and now we are buying fuel, which means that we are paying for that with using scarce foreign exchange. And we need to put on the records that Petrotrin has been for years a net earner of foreign exchange. Information is coming out that Trafigura is one of the companies that we used to sell our fuels to. We used to also benefit from the sale of our fuel in the local market, the Caribbean, certain parts of Latin America, and the eastern seaboard of the US. And what they have been able to achieve at this stage is a situation in which we have moved out of what we call a major downstream, and we are now importing those fuels from BP Latin America. So in my view, while we are critical of the Prime Minister and the others, yes, we have to be critical of them, we have failed in our analysis to point out the role of the transnational corporation and the multilateral institution in this whole process.
Okay, so you were saying that first of all there was mismanagement and the investment in equipment and so on apparently was not done appropriately, right? That's part of it. And Mr. Kamara is saying, to add to that, that the role of the multinationals, the role of the IMF for that matter, has to be noted in terms of this entire situation. That in fact, the intention was really to privatize rather than have a national or nationalized entity. And so maybe we are looking at a planned situation on the part of certain interest groups. And the plan, of course, is towards privatization. Okay, so you were about to add.
I wanted to say something.
Oh, right, okay,
Yeah,
Mr. Kangalee.
Because Kamara spoke about the role of the international financial institutions and the policy that they have had in place, which he's saying now because of the weakness of the labor movement and the progressive movement, it's timely. They believe that they can get through it now. Now let us put this thing in a context. They have been trying to do this thing since the early 80s. When George Chambers' government came out with the imperatives of adjustment, that was Bob report and all these things, they had stated quite clearly, and it was a straightforward IMF approach. They have the same approach for the last many years, that we needed to go through a period of structural adjustment, and this period would involve certain things like trade liberalization, deregulation, reduction of the public sector, more private sector participation in the economy. The problem, though, with that private sector participation is that the so-called local private sector here really were merchants. They were not really into heavy industry or making risky investments or anything like that. So in that sense, privatization of certain areas would have gone back into the arms of the foreign multinational corporations. But what happened in the 80s is that they were fought every step of the way by the labor movement and the progressive movement. If you look at the 1980s, we had more strikes, troubles, and this went on until 1989 when we had the general strike on March 6, 1989, which shut the country down completely. The problem, though, was that during the 90s, the situation began to shift after the so-called Cooperatives, whatever it was, right? The military adventure. Throughout the 90s, with the trade liberalization, and remember we went to the IMF and so on for support for balance of payments and so on, obviously a conditionality program which started to carry out the very things I said that the IMF wanted to do. That was when we had the wage freeze, the wage cut, the public service, the taking away of COLA, when they started to privatize things like Gerald, cement, the power generation capacity of TNTech and some other areas. So that from the early 1990s, even down to the health sector was hived off from the public sector, and the RHAs was set up. One of the key elements in terms of getting that policy through was to break the back of the trade unions. And they started to do that in the 1990s when they separated the health sector into the regional health authorities and so on. Up to now, the union that was there before, which is the Public Service Association, they no longer have representation for RHA workers, and healthcare workers have probably about 20%. So, piece by piece, they weakened the labor movement. They were able, over the last few years here, to win the ideological battle. Battle for the hearts and minds of people and so on. The labor movement itself went into major retreat with the retrenchments of the 1990s, and a lot of the leaderships of the labor movement proved unequal to the task. So that a big gap began to grow between the leadership of the labor movement and the members of the trade unions, which was different to how it was before in the days of the 60s. In the 60s, there was a very close relationship. So what we have now, when the attack came, the forces of resistance were scattered. The leadership of the trade men could not mobilize their membership, and they made a lot of horrible mistakes anyway. You don't have to go into all of that, but their leadership skills were soon up to be lacking. It was very clear to the government, it was very clear to the employers. In fact, the Chamber of Commerce had a meeting in March 1 where they actually sat down and said they were going to attack the industrial court. They were going to harass the trade unions. Every time the trade unions won a case in the industrial court, they were going to appeal it, knowing that they would not win the appeal, but then they would stretch you out and so on. So we have not only the international financial institutions being able to institute their long-awaited program, but we also had a government which was more or less facilitative of that. And we also had a private sector here join the fund and also began to, because for instance, in the energy industry, the ancillary industries like catering, like transport, barges, marine transport, engineering services and so on are done by local companies. And a lot of these companies were able to get police out and farm out arrangements in young fields. And they believe that this is the time now when they are going to be able to control the production of oil itself, both in Gulf and onshore. So I think what we have is a coming together of all these forces,
local and international,
and focused. They all have the same focus, and they are dealing with the traditional forces of resistance who hardly put up any resistance. That is the situation.
Well, it seems to me that there's no resistance, or am I not getting the right
there would be resistance, but it's not organized. That's the point. You know, there would be people who think, and there would be people who tried stuff and so on, but given our history, especially in the energy industry, with the weakness of the oil field workers trade union, that is from the beginning. The OWQ has been deteriorating since the early 90s, since under the days of Gerald Here now is they're not in a position to mount any serious resistance, and you also wonder.
Or is it because of the way in which the whole thing was done?
Not only that, you also wonder whether some of these leaders don't want to really engage in that kind of resistance. There are reasons for that. There are a lot of personal aggrandizements and personal interests involved in a lot of the trade union leaderships and so on. A lot of bureaucratization has taken place. And you know, when I first entered the trade union movement, a trade unionist was a member of a union. Today a trade unionist is a guy who's on an executive or something.
Can we step back a little bit just to see exactly how this was executed? Now, from what I gather, well, let me get your views, because I've been given some ideas too. November was the month, right? The workers were not given any warning. Is that so?
Up to about July. We have the documents. Before you leave, you give me an email address. I will send some stuff.
That's July 2018.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Up to about July, every statement that was made about Petrotrin, they had been doing studies on Petrotrin since 2017, the Lashley report and all these things. None of the reports, none of the statements made by the Minister of Energy or by the Prime Minister, and we have a lot of statements we can send for you about what they said, had suggested anything about the closing down of Petrotrin.
Okay.
They were saying Petrotrin has some problems, we need to solve these problems, in order to solve these problems, we need to blah, 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 right? And that went on, January, February, they held a lot of big conferences in the Hyatt.
Yes, so what happened is that the different consultants the government had hired to deal with the internal situation on record, none of them have recommended the
The breakup.
closure of the
Closure, yeah.
it was a shock to the country, and it reminds us very much of a book done on disaster capitalism, in which it is stated that one of the approaches that you use is where you create shock to the people involved. Now, what we need to recognize here is that, as Brother Kangalee clarified, this has been on the policy agenda for quite some time. It was a question of timing, and the chairman of Petrotrin at the time, who I would describe as an economic hitman, had in fact done that kind of work in RDC and Trinidad Cement Limited, which eventually ended up in the hands of Cemex, which for quite some time had just about 20% of the shares of TCL. So that what we need to pay attention to is that what took place was part of an agenda. We need also to point out that Wendell Motley, who was the representative president, was in fact the head of an energy subcommittee, and it is not surprising that he was given the
honor of that. Up to July, nobody really anticipated or thought that something was going awry or such.
Yes.
But when was the first indication that they were going to lead down this road to destroying the company?
So what they actually did, they got rid of the workers in the refinery, they got rid of the workers in the fields, and what they have done since is they have rehired some workers in the fields. Because
now by November, in other words, between late August and November, you have gradual retrenchment.
Well, not really. What you have was working, because you have the work packages. They have laws saying how to deal with retrenchment. They have a union agreement with a retrenchment schedule, a severance benefit schedule. You have to pay people things that you owe them, because they have back pay for people who have not yet been paid their back pay, holiday pay. So there's a lot of accounting stuff had to take place.
Would be done in September, October.
In September, October. And then they will be holding a lot of meetings with the workers, explaining to them how they are going to be terminated and all of that. So it was enough chaos. Yeah, you understand?
Yes. So what we had during that period also was that the psychologists were mentioning that what the shock that people experience could result in people committing suicide, could result in psychological trauma. So I believe that recognizing that, I think you had cases in which I think psychological counseling was made available, taking place post the 30th of November.
Okay, right.
No, well, actually, no. Actually, yeah, it would have been, what they would have done, they would call in groups of the workers, they would explain to them what were their options in terms of how to access their terminal benefits and so on. And they would bring these counselors to tell people, well, why this is a devastating thing. It's also an opportunity. The usual talk, right? It's an opportunity. So you would get some money and so on, and you could invest it in whatever and business and the usual talk, right? But they always do that when you go into retrench people. You bring in these counselors and so on. You are going to show people at the end of the world. Right?
I just want to add that during that period, the people in the fence line, what is called the fence line communities, Marabella, Gasper, started to express the kind of impact the decision was having on their lives, in terms of business, in terms of dealing with their whole family life. And that was, a lot of it was covered in the newspaper. What also came out is that temporary and casual workers were told in no uncertain terms that they were not part of the whole plan in terms of the terminal benefits.
To clarify that a bit, you had in the refinery, you had 1,700 permanent workers, but you had hundreds of so-called temporary workers. Some of
who were not really temporary.
No, what in Trinidad we call temporaries.
But they were really there. They were there for a long time.
Casual worker roster, which really would be casual workers. No. When they had first started to talk about how many jobs would be lost, they were only focusing on the permanent workers. Of course, the union would raise the issue, but there are X hundreds of temporary workers. So they came up with something that was saying, well, if these temporary workers had worked for X amount of hours in the 5 years before they were retrenched or whatever, then some of them did get some termination benefits, right? A lot of them didn't. Although some guys would have been only working for 6 years or 7 years, other guys might have been working for 20 years. Sometimes the guy who worked for 6 or 7 years, he would be eligible for termination benefits, and the other guys won't because they did not work a certain amount of hours just before.
Okay,
So there was all that craziness. When they asked SPNA, how can you do that? He said, well, we can't develop a formula based on feeling sorry for people. This is the guy who was
the chairman of Petrotrin.
One thing you have to give him, he's very consistent. He doesn't come and play games. He tells you that he doesn't care about it.
But why didn't Espinat and the board not initiate certain programs and so on? If they felt that, okay, you know, the company was running at a loss or whatever, couldn't they have tried to bring in some changes?
The point I think is that it wasn't up to them. I don't think it was up to them. I think they were sent, SPNA particularly was sent into Petrotrin to break up the company.
How long was he chair?
He hadn't been there for long, just a couple of years, because Gerald was there before him. He probably was there for less than 2 years.
Oh, less than 2 years.
And they sent him there.
So the real hitman, really?
Yes.
Economic hitman.
And his history is there. So I don't think
now who sent him there though? That's under which administration?
Rowley.
It's still Rowley.
Yeah.
So can we say therefore, I'm trying to get the mindset of Rowley, where, you know, this was his plan, or he was sent in?
Okay, he made it very clear that the past prime minister was afraid to do what had to be done.
Okay, and that he was the one who would do it. Economic hitman. Did we see any indication of that mindset in Rowley during the campaign and during his years in parliament?
Yes, he always adopted the persona that he was the big bad dog. And to me, he is a disciple of structural adjustment and new policy changes. And
a distinction between the upper ranks of the union.
That's right.
And the bulk of the labor members who were not probably aware of what was going on, or at least who were not connected, who were disconnected.
I think that is a much better term.
Yes, who were disconnected from the leadership.
That's right.
All right, so you have that disconnection. Then you have these other components, these other forces, international, local, the so-called Comprador group.
That's right.
And they took the opportunity now to link up with Rowley, who is an EHM, right? Economic hitman in his own way.
When it was Petrotrin had a state police force. Hundreds of policemen who understand what's going on in there. They understand how the oil fields operate, how they function. And as soon as their time was up for them to leave, amalgamated security was coming in to the oil field. Amalgamated security owned by the Macal the McCanny All-Sons group. So you retrench everybody who were working in the Gulf and on land. And then you set up certain firms to recruit people. Well, half the number is not the same among the people. Half the number, half the pay with no working conditions, and so on. So what you're actually seeing is the rewards are already being distributed.
The shock and awe model using Petrotrin will be applied apparently in other sectors, and already there's indication that this is being done. So in other words, are we looking at structural adjustment without the IMF?
Yes. Yes.
IMF structural adjustment without the IMF.
Yes, and why that is so true, it is because we know that the IMF normally comes in when your import cover was negative.
Yes.
And in our case, at this time, I think we have about 8 months worth of import cover. But notwithstanding that, we are seeing the standard prescription measures being introduced. And one of the top ones is the privatization of state enterprises.
You see, that's why I know Mr. Kangalee said that the IMF visit in June or July didn't have too much to do with this, but I don't know if I believe that as yet. I don't know. What do you think, Mr. Kamara?
What I know is that every year you have your consultation. That is one. Secondly, I also know that the IMF now has an office in the financial complex. So they are here physically. Okay?
As of 2018 or?
No. We have been here for quite
a while. Okay.
Quite a number of
all right.
And in my view, the IMF may not necessarily be the main agency used in the Trinidad and Tobago context, given the kind of campaign we had against the IMF in the 1980s. You have to remember, I am the author of the IMF Petrotrin and Tobago in the Caribbean. At that time, I was an executive member of NG, and we had a national campaign. We must also remember the OWTU teamed up with a former economist.
Enough is enough. Davidson Boodoo, yes.
When he left the IMF,
yes,
he came to the Local Trade Union. I was with the union at the time, and the union gave him that platform. The union actually reprinted his letter to Camdesus.
Yeah.
That as a result of that campaign,
yes,
you had greater emphasis being paid on the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. That is a strategy that they employ in different parts of the world. One of the players in recent times is the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. And that particular institution has been providing financing for firms like Guardian Life, for Sagicor. So we must not ever discount the role of the IFC in the whole structural adjustment program in the Caribbean.
Talked a lot about the technical changes that took place. We talked about the interest groups involved, from international, local, the alliances, the economic hitmen.
You like it?
I like that. But the question is, of course, what should be done now? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think a lot of violations took place in terms of the execution. Let us assume that there really was need for improvements in terms of the operations of the various plants and so on. Let us assume that there was some need to improve on the profitability and so on of the state institution and so on. The fact is that you can't come overnight and tell people, pack your bags and go, and bring the police, soldiers, and probably a few dogs, pit bulls, right, to get people out of the plant. You don't do that in a situation where people worked for 30 years, 20 years, 10 years. You don't even do it for somebody who worked for 1 year. And so I am thinking, I've been reflecting on what message we should send to the establishment, the political establishment, the alliances and so on. Is there a case for bringing in some other forces to at least document or at least recognize or at least put a word of caution, to avoid a repeat of the situation? Because this was really done in a callous way.
Callousness or not, I think as a stage, I think we have reached a point where we cannot change this. If we're talking about now, you were mentioning, well, there were problems with profitability or whatever, and you could have changed the management system.
Yeah, I'm just giving.
But my view on that, you can't, given the model that they use in terms of say that you can't do that. Once you start to try to run the thing how it is supposed to be run, you run into problems, because the political party system we have here is one that when I get into office, winner takes all, and I have to ensure that my financiers and my foot soldiers and so on are properly rewarded. Patrick Manning lost the first time in the 1991-95 era. He lost the election because he didn't have the kind of wherewithal that the government had subsequent to that, and he tried to play it straight, and he lost the election, and his people told him, man, you're playing the fool. When you get there, you have to fix us. And that is how the system runs. It's the same thing happened when the people came into power. So what I'm saying, it's not that the other party is against how the system runs, it's that they are not in office. When they go into office, they do the same bloody thing. So my point is that to reform the state enterprise system in itself, it can work. You have to reform the entire socio-political and economic system that we have here, which, in my humble view,
that's a huge task.
It's not going to be done.
That's a gargantuan task.
It is not going to be done from the top down. That can only happen here if those people who are in charge of the country in terms of the economics particularly start to become afraid of what can happen to them. Because I'll tell you something, you see the dismemberment of the trade union movement, or the attempted dismemberment. If the trade unions are no longer in a position to act as a conduit between the mass of people and the ruling elites, then these people are cutting off their nose to spite your face. Because if you get rid of that conduit, which has a procedure and a thing, and everybody accepts that and so on, and you have to deal with the masses face to face, you're going to end up in a lot of trouble. That is why probably Mr. Griffith is the Commissioner of Police now, because somebody has recognized that this thing, if it keeps going like this, you're going to end up with street fights and things in this country.
Well,
because the young guys in the we have a lot of guns all over this country.
Yeah.
With young people with guns in their hands, and whoever is able to influence them in whatever particular direction is going to have a hell of a force out there. I think they're past that stage about speaking truth to power and think power understands truth. They know what the truth, they have the truth. So I think we have reached up to the stage. If the trade unions and the other forces, organized forces, are able, and I wish they would, or have, or can, reform how they are moving and get back to basics, then maybe we have a chance of doing this thing without going through a whole bloody something. If they can't do it, then I am certain that we're going to end up with crashing in the streets.
Okay.
I don't want that, you know.
Yes, yes.
But
Yes.
history tells me that.
Okay.
So what's
My position, similarly, but I put it a little different. The first thing we have to recognize is that we, the people, did not determine the rules of the game. So anytime we are going into any arrangement where the rules of the game are being set by them, we are putting ourselves in a trap. Because we never sat down as a people to determine what are the rules of the game for our interests. And I'm saying that is fundamental. So let us begin the discussion, begin the mobilization, begin the activity in terms of what are the rules of the game.
Right.
That's number
Following
one.
up on what you say, therefore, it suggests that those who are in a position to influence or to condition a particular approach are in a position have to be able to take up that burden then.
such as which
I'll give you an example.
Okay.
I'm talking about.
Yes.
We have the retrenchment of workers from the energy sector. We have retrenchment of workers from TSTP.
Right.
These workers have knowledge, they have experience, they have expertise, they have energy. But they are only accustomed in terms of working in a particular type of dispensation. What prevents them from establishing, for example, Trinidad and Tobago Energy Cooperative Society, in which energy is not only defined as hydrocarbons, energy is also seen as alternative energy. And notwithstanding the challenges of getting that, let us say, sustained, we begin with what I call the first steps. The Commissioner of Cooperatives Department, we have it registered, and we begin the Trinidad and Tobago Energy Cooperative Society, encompassing all of us. I'm saying as a start.
Yes, but how are we going to get there?
We are going to get there by making a step. Why? A number of people right now are being encouraged to go into small business, etc., etc. But they're going to go back in the same old rules of the game. Because they are going to be what? Small capitalist enterprises. And many of them will not survive because of the competition, because of the whole whatever. So I'm saying, we could therefore begin with a different principle, with different rules.
What you have to do is to foment a revolt within the trade union movement. And
Sort of refocus again. One, you are calling for a restructuring of the trade union
I'm calling for a revolt within the trade union.
with
Both the trade unions and the credit unions and the cooperative movement and other, other people of that ilk to see that, with some kind of collaboration they could get stuff going then. It isn't as difficult as it may sound because all of these people are the same people.
all right, so the way forward is a sort of more integrated linkage between the cooperatives, the credit union movements, and progressive members of the labor movement. Do you see a role for external forces or so?
Yes. It means therefore that in this crisis we need greater cooperation between those progressive international labor federation, the progressive international cooperative movement, and the regional labor and cooperative organization.
Do you have any specific movements in mind or organizations?
Okay. There is the Mondragon cooperative model in Spain, which, in my view, we could learn quite a lot from. And the cooperative movement in Ireland. Two of them represent what I will call true success stories.
That's the term collapse, I like it. The capitalist system is in a state of collapse. And because of that, people are being forced to do stuff that they wouldn't think of 10 years or 15 years ago. That they
and there's also the competition with China too.
Okay, so you have that. I want to just make one qualification here. All these nice things that we're talking here that may be possible and so on. To me, this is just my view.
Yes.
Could only take off in the midst of a crisis. If we just go about saying, yes, let's do this, and people say, yeah, it sounds good, blah, blah, blah. It could only happen in the midst of a crisis, when it reaches that point where people realize, boy, this country going through, and see the same thing that I'm talking about, we started to see incipient revolt taking place and so on. I suspect that is the time when these ideas might start to gain traction, because people will be desperate and people would be looking for a way out. Almost some people hoping that the thing will get worse.
Yes.
Hoping, and everybody is scared that it will. And I am certain it will get worse. And I am saying the worse it gets, is the more opportunity that you have to get radical ideas out there. That is my view.
Okay, I think you were about to...
In fact, only last week, members of the OWTU, and I'm talking now about members who are retired, were in a meeting to discuss a possible medical insurance plan.
Right, yes, I heard about that.
Okay,
yes.
so that tells us that notwithstanding what is taking place, this crisis has forced the membership to look at an alternative and work up their own medical insurance plan. That's just
okay. Take the opportunity to thank you for sacrificing your time, energy, etc. For us to have this discussion, and I'll try my best to make it available as soon as possible.